probably about 1910 or 11, the movies came to Monrovia. They came without much fanfare and without a specific movie-dedicated location. There were no movie theaters in Monrovia, but there were storefronts. So they would take a regular store or a storefront, put in a projection booth, a screen, and seats, and bill it as a theater. One of the earliest ones was on Myrtle Avenue, probably in the 200 block, because I believe it was in the Spence and Stedman block, the west side of the street, a building no longer there, and it was called the Elite Theater. There are pictures of it. In fact, there are pictures in the Legacy collection of the Elite Theater. Later on, or perhaps simultaneously with the Elite, was another storefront theater, 100 block of East Olive. I believe it was the Majestic Theater. There was nothing majestic about it. Again, a converted storefront, projection booth, screen, rows of seating put in. And since it was a flat surface, it probably was not that really easy to see around the woman in front of you who had a large floppy hat on, which as was the style at the time. My dad's story was of being taken to that theater on East Olive as a youngster to see D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. This would have been about 1915, I'm guessing. I think it came, well, maybe 1916. Came out, I think it was released, I believe, in 1915 and probably reached Monrovia that year or a little later. The first building constructed specifically for theater purposes was the Colonial Theater at 314 South Myrtle Avenue, across from Library Park. It opened in 1920. It has had a theater marquee, a very simple canopy, basically, with the ability to put raised letters on the edge of the canopy advertising what was being played. The theater opened with the feature Judy of Rogues Harbor, starring Mary Miles Minter. It flourished for 4 or 5 years without competition, although maybe some of the old storefront theaters continued. And then in 1925, the Lyric Theater opened in the 200 block of East Foothill on the north side, in a large building, again, constructed specifically for theater purposes. The theater was in the center, but not right on the corner, but set back from the corner a little bit, a centrally placed ticket booth, lobby area. It didn't have a balcony as such, but it did have sloping seats, and there was a loge section where for a little extra you could have the comfort of a seat that had a backing where you could lean back comfortably, and it had a sort of hood affair so you had a bit more privacy, especially for the ladies if they were watching a tearjerker and had to discreetly dab at their eyes. Anyway, the feature that had was a Wurlitzer pipe organ, because it was, all right, still the silent era. So those theaters, those movies would have been accompanied by the Wurlitzer, the mighty Wurlitzer pipe organ at the Lyric. The Colonial Theater had something, but I don't think it was a pipe organ. It might have been a musical instrument of some kind to accompany the music, certainly not a pipe organ.
So the films themselves had no music?
They had no music, they had captions. So there's this great line delivered by Gloria Swanson in this classic Sunset Boulevard. She's emulating Norma Desmond, a great star of the silent screen. And somehow the topic of talkies comes up. And her classic line is, "We didn't need voices, we had faces." Anyway, yeah, if you look at the silent film picture, the facial expressions are to us exaggerated, but they needed to be in order to capture or convey the emotion the actor or actress was feeling at that moment. because you'd see that first, then you'd see the caption that would explain perhaps what was going on. But given expressive faces and exaggerated facial expressions, it wasn't too hard to figure out exactly what was going on. So silent films came along. The Wurlitzer finally fell into disuse. About 1947, there was a drive to relocate the Wurlitzer from the Lyric Theater to the auditorium at Monrovia High School. When the high school was completed in 1929, there were organ chambers in the auditorium, but no pipe organ. So almost 20 years later, grassroots effort, the Wurlitzer was purchased from the theater and relocated to the high school auditorium. It was used in the 50s and 60s. It was used pretty regularly until the organist, who was also an English instructor, retired, and there was no one to take his place. It was used for assemblies. I can still remember standing in the auditorium and singing the alma mater, accompanied by the Wurlitzer pipe organ. And then in the spring, when the Spring Music Festival took place, it was always featured in some of the musical offerings. If it was especially appropriate, there would be this musical accompaniment. For anything that was not a cappella, the Wurlitzer was used to accompany together with piano. I can remember singing Wally Richter's The Creation, which was the first verses or first chapters of Genesis. In the beginning, and then we do that. And then when it said, God said there was light, the mighty Wurlitzer would chime in with this huge fuselage of sound depicting the arrival of light on the scene. It's all very dramatic. Anyway, the Wurlitzer languished and the console was removed, and I don't know if it's there or not. It may be gone. The theater itself went through a name change. It became the Crest Theater. In the 70s, early 70s, finally reached the end of its useful life. The interesting part about the Crest Theater marquee is it was used in 1974. The marquee itself was used to advertise the candidacy of one Bob Bartlett, Eric Faith, and Patricia Ostry. And it was effective. That wasn't the only thing they did to advertise, but it was an effective thing to do.
For city council.
For city council. They ran as a team, as a triumvirate, and were successfully elected, and that's a whole other story. But that was part of the election process, was using the marquee of the then dormant Lyric Crest Theater to advertise.
And what about the Colonial Theater? How long did it last?
Colonial Theater had a checkered career, was open on and off over the years. It went from the Colonial to the Monrovia Theater, and it operated under that name for the rest of its useful life. I think it was maybe closed in the late 40s or early 50s. It opened for a while in the early 1950s. I may have mentioned that that's where I saw my first 3D film, Moana Devil. And we all had to put on these ridiculous looking glasses so we could see the 3D film. About 1955, the front part of the theater was demolished, the front part containing the snack bar, restrooms, projection booth, and balcony, because the Monrovia had an actual balcony, went up a flight of stairs to reach the very small balcony. That whole front, I'd say 1/3 of the building, was demolished and then rebuilt to contain a furniture store. However, the rear part, with the proscenium arch, was not changed. They did install a mezzanine, but years later, when it was serving as an antique store, you could go upstairs in the back rear and still see the original proscenium arch from the 1920s in place. They didn't replace it. Lyric was torn down probably about 1975, 76. There's some dramatic pictures of the interior as it was being gutted. You can see the elaborate interior furnishings, lots and lots of ornate stucco work. but you can also see the roof was being removed, and you can see all the steel trusses in a heap in the foreground. A shameful end to what had once been a really dramatic structure. Art Deco in style, Art Deco with some Art Nouveau touches. Anyway, it was quite a building. And at one point, the residence structure complex that succeeded it years later was called the Lyric, and that changed over from apartments into the present Brookdale. But the ghosts of the theater are still there. The theaters, the storefront theaters, of course, were phased out as they were replaced by true theater buildings and features. Birth of a Nation, Judy of Rose Harbor. Those are the ones I can think of right offhand. So just a couple things to add to the Lyric that I thought of in the telling of the story. My first movie that I saw was at the Lyric, and it was either National Velvet, starring Elizabeth Taylor, or Walt Disney's Song of the South. I can remember them both. I can't remember the order in which I saw them, but I suspect I might have seen National Velvet first. I was probably all of about 6 or 7, and I think my mother reluctantly agreed that it was okay for me to go to the theater, that my morals were not going to be corrupted. So National Velvet, with a very young and very beautiful Elizabeth Taylor, and Songs of the South with Uncle Remus, Brer Rabbit and the Briar Patch, Zippity Doo Dah, and a few other really memorable things.